Willa Nash was only 25 years old when she discovered that the life she had spent years carefully building had already been destroyed long before she ever had the chance to begin it for most of her childhood. She believed her family was simply struggling financially. She grew up in the quiet town of Millbury, where everybody knew each other. Church gossip traveled faster than the local newspaper, and appearances mattered more than honesty. Her mother, Diane, worked long shifts at a craft supply store near the highway, while her father, Carl, spent years driving a forklift at an auto parts plant until layoffs hit the town. Hard money was never openly discussed in their house. It floated around like a storm cloud. Nobody was allowed to point at directly. Bills were hidden in drawers, coupons covered the kitchen table, and every conversation about finances ended with silence or excuses. Willa learned early that asking for anything usually meant hearing the same soft answer from her mother. Family shares. Everything, sweetheart, your turn will come later. But later never seemed to arrive for her. Her older brother, Todd, always had what he needed: baseball uniforms, braces, a used Honda Civic for his 16th birthday, and eventually full tuition paid for at college. Willa, meanwhile, worked every chance she got. She spent summers serving frozen yogurt to tourists, weekends organizing books at the library, and nights studying spreadsheets and statistics because numbers made more sense to her than people did. By the time she graduated from Ohio State University with a degree in statistics, she had learned how to survive on almost nothing. She worked 3 part-time jobs through college, skipped vacations, reused old textbooks, and paid cash for everything because her parents raised her to fear credit cards and debt. She believed that if she stayed disciplined enough, careful enough, responsible enough, her future would eventually become stable. What she did not know was that while she counted every dollar to buy groceries and pay tuition, someone else had been living an entirely different life under her identity. At 23 years old, Willa finally landed her first real job as a data analyst at an insurance company in Columbus. It was not glamorous, but to her it felt like freedom. She rented a tiny apartment with narrow windows and an outdated kitchen, and for the first time in her life, she thought she was stepping into adulthood on her own terms. She filled out the apartment application with pride attached to her paycheck information, paid the application fee, and imagined how she would decorate the space once she moved in. But 3 days later, the property manager called with a tone that immediately made her stomach tighten. He explained that her application could not be approved because of significant issues on her credit report. At first, Willa thought it had to be a mistake. She had never opened a credit card, never financed a car, never signed for loans or missed payments because she had never borrowed money in the first place. Confused and embarrassed, she opened her laptop and requested her credit reports from all 3 major bureaus. What she found changed everything. The report stretched across dozens of pages filled with accounts she had never seen before: credit cards maxed out for years, overdue utility bills, collection notices, civil judgments, vehicle loans, and business debts totaling more than $340,000. Some of the accounts had been opened when she was only 14 years old. Others used altered versions of her birth year to make her appear legally old enough to qualify for loans. Every account listed the same address: her parents' home. Willa sat frozen on the floor, unable to breathe properly as page after page revealed that her identity had been used for nearly a decade without her knowledge. But unlike most people, Willa was trained to see patterns. Once the shock faded, the analyst inside her took over. She created spreadsheets, sorted dates, traced phone numbers, cross-referenced financial records, and searched public business filings until one name appeared repeatedly across multiple debts: Nash Event Rentals, LLC. The deeper Willa investigated, the more horrifying the truth became. The business had been registered entirely under her name and social security number. When she was just a freshman in high school, official state records showed her listed as the owner and registered agent of an event rental company that handled bounce houses, party tents, folding chairs, and equipment rentals. Across the county, the filing date stopped her cold. It had been created on her 14th birthday while she was blowing out candles on a grocery store birthday cake and wishing for a replacement laptop. Someone had been sitting at a computer forging her signature and building an entire business using her identity. The company had operated for years, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue before collapsing under debt, unpaid taxes, lawsuits, and collections that now followed Willa everywhere she went. She remembered every time her parents claimed they could not afford school trips or help with tuition. She remembered Hearing there was no money before watching her mother bring home expensive furniture weeks later, slowly memories that once felt random began fitting together like pieces of a brutal puzzle. All those years her parents had not simply been struggling, they had been financing their lives through their daughter's stolen identity, trembling with anger and disbelief. Willa finally called her mother and asked directly whether she had opened a business under her daughter's name. After several seconds of silence, her mother laughed casually, almost amused that Willa was upset. Family shares everything, she said, as if years of fraud and financial ruin were no more serious than borrowing a sweater. Without permission, her father took the phone next and insisted she was blowing things out of proportion, promising they would eventually fix the debt when they were financially stable again. But Willa realized something devastating in that moment. They were not sorry because they never believed they had done anything wrong to them. Her identity was simply another family resource to use. When times became difficult, sitting alone with pages of debt records spread across her screen, Willa understood that the greatest thing her parents had stolen was not money, it was trust. They had taken her future before she was even old enough to understand what a future was. Willa Nash sat awake night after night staring at the ceiling of her college roommate's tiny apartment, realizing that her entire adult life had been sabotaged before it had even started. After discovering more than $340,000 of fraudulent debt tied to her identity, she quickly learned that the damage reached far beyond unpaid bills. Her credit score had collapsed to 387, a number so low that banks treated her like a financial criminal. She could not rent an apartment, could not qualify for a car loan, could not open a basic credit card, and could barely pass background screenings that most people never even think about. Every future milestone she had worked toward, buying a home, building savings, creating stability, had been poisoned by decisions she never made. The worst part was that none of it came from strangers, it came from the people who raised her. Her parents had stolen her identity so completely that she felt invisible inside her own financial life, like a ghost watching someone else wear her name with nowhere else to go. Willa moved into the cramped one-bedroom apartment of her former college roommate, Cass Donnelly, in the quiet neighborhood of Clintonville. Cass let her sleep on an air mattress beside a bookshelf stacked with old novels and nursing textbooks, and every morning Willa woke to the sound of automated debt collection calls flooding her phone before sunrise. Some days there were 6 calls before breakfast, other days there were 8. Every voicemail carried the same robotic tone, demanding payment for balances she had never created. At first she tried explaining that she had been a child when the accounts were opened, but collection agencies did not care about explanations. They wanted money, they wanted payment plans, they wanted account numbers, they wanted anything that sounded like responsibility, even if the debt belonged to someone else. Slowly the stress began hollowing her out. She stopped sleeping properly, coffee replaced meals, her entire existence became stacks of paperwork spread across Cass' kitchen floor. 47-page credit reports, account summaries, tax transcripts, collection notices, and legal documents arranged in chronological order like evidence in a murder case. Cass watched her build spreadsheets at 2 a.m. with red eyes and trembling hands, and finally told her the truth. Nobody else would say this isn't normal anymore. Willa, you need a lawyer. The idea of hiring an attorney terrified her because it meant acknowledging something she still desperately wanted to avoid, that the people responsible were her parents. Eventually, she scheduled a meeting with Rebecca Holt, a consumer rights attorney working with the Franklin County Legal Aid Office in Columbus. Rebecca had spent years handling fraud cases, but even she looked disturbed while reading through Willa's documents. After several long minutes of silence, she removed her glasses and admitted it was one of the worst cases of child identity theft she had seen in over a decade. Willa hoped there would be some simple solution, some technical loophole that could erase the debt without destroying her family, but Rebecca explained the reality with painful clarity. To remove the fraudulent accounts, Willa would need to file identity theft affidavits, dispute the debts with all 3 major credit bureaus, and most importantly, submit an official police report naming the people who committed the fraud. There was no way around it. The financial institutions would never erase hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt based solely on her word. They needed names, they needed evidence, they needed criminal accusations. Hearing those words out loud felt like swallowing glass. Willa stared down at the paperwork covered in forged signatures and incorrect birth years, realizing her own parents had spent years carefully manipulating systems designed to protect people. They had altered her date of birth multiple times to qualify for loans while she was still underage. They had used her social security number to open business accounts, personal credit cards, utility services, and vehicle financing. The fraud was Not impulsive or accidental, it was organized, deliberate, and sustained over nearly a decade. Rebecca advised her not to wait too long because interest was still accumulating daily under Willa's name, making the damage worse every month. But instead of filing immediately, Willa spent the next week digging deeper into the evidence, driven by the part of her brain trained to analyze patterns. What she uncovered made the betrayal even more devastating: the fake business her parents created under her identity. Nash Event Rentals LLC had not simply existed on paper, it had generated real income for years. Her mother had opened at least 6 separate credit cards, using variations of Willa's birth year to bypass age restrictions. Then Willa uncovered a $28,000 auto loan connected to a 2019 Chevy Tahoe financed entirely under her stolen identity. Curious and horrified, she searched public vehicle registration records and confirmed exactly what she feared: the SUV was registered directly to her mother at the family home in Millbury. Suddenly, she could picture it clearly: her mother driving to church every Sunday in a luxury vehicle purchased with debt attached to her daughter's future. Every grocery trip, every family dinner, every holiday gathering had been financed by fraud hidden behind the phrase family shares everything. When Willa confronted her older brother Todd, hoping at least one person in the family had been unaware, his silence told her the truth. Before his words ever did, he admitted he had known parts of it. Their parents had explained that they needed to use Willa's identity because their own credit was ruined after their father lost his job years earlier. Todd defended them by claiming they were only trying to survive, but then he accidentally revealed something that completely shattered Willa's understanding of her family. The money generated through Nash Event Rentals had helped pay for his college tuition at Bowling Green State University, while Willa worked 3 jobs and survived on scholarships because her parents insisted they could not afford to help her. Todd's education had quietly been funded through loans and tax filings attached to her stolen identity. The realization hit her like physical pain. Her brother had built his future on the ruins of hers and convinced himself it was normal because their parents framed it as sacrifice for the family. But the deepest blow arrived weeks later when Willa requested her IRS tax transcripts. The records showed 7 years of fraudulent tax returns filed under her Social Security number beginning when she was only 16 years old. The filings listed her as the owner of Nash Event Rentals LLC and reported tens of thousands of dollars in annual income. She had never earned refund checks totaling thousands of dollars had been deposited into accounts she had never seen. When Rebecca Holt reviewed the documents, her expression changed immediately. This was no longer simple identity theft filing. Fraudulent tax returns under another person's Social Security number crossed into federal tax fraud, wire fraud, and potentially mail fraud territory. The case could now involve federal investigators. As the stack of evidence grew taller on Cass' kitchen table, Willa realized the truth she had been avoiding for months. Her parents had not merely borrowed her identity. During desperate times, they had systematically built an entire second life using her name while convincing themselves it was an act of love. Willa Nash spent the next several days trapped between guilt and fury, replaying every conversation with her mother in her head until the words no longer sounded like excuses, they sounded like threats wrapped in love. Her mother kept insisting that everything had been temporary, that she and Carl had always planned to pay the debt back before Willa ever needed credit. But Willa needed credit now. She needed it 3 weeks earlier when she was denied her apartment application and forced to move onto an air mattress in her friend's cramped living room. She needed it when banks rejected her for a simple credit card. She needed it every time another collection agency called before sunrise demanding payment for accounts she had never opened. Yet every time Willa tried explaining the damage, her mother shifted from tearful apologies into cold strategy. Diane Nash had spent years learning how to manipulate conversations, and Willa recognized the pattern immediately. The crying would stop, the voice would flatten, and suddenly the conversation was no longer about fraud. It was about loyalty. If you tell the police, her mother warned quietly over the phone, you'll destroy this family. That sentence stayed with Willa long after the call ended. It was not an apology. It was a reminder that in her parents' minds, protecting the family mattered more than protecting their daughter. They genuinely believed survival justified theft. When Willa argued that stealing her identity had destroyed her future, her mother answered with the same phrase she had used since childhood: a mother does Whatever it takes to keep her family together, but this time Willa finally understood what the phrase actually meant. It meant her parents believed her identity belonged to them, her future belonged to them, even her financial life belonged to them if they needed it badly enough. After the call ended, Willa sat alone on the kitchen floor of Cass Donnelly's apartment beside the slowly deflating air mattress and made 2 columns on a yellow legal pad. On one side, she wrote reasons to file charges. Restore credit, remove debt, reclaim her future, hold someone accountable. On the other side, she wrote reasons not to. Her parents could go to prison. Todd might never forgive her. Relatives would call her ungrateful. Holidays would disappear forever. She stared at the list for hours because both sides felt equally devastating. Cass eventually found her awake at 2 in the morning, still sitting there exhausted and hollow-eyed after reading both columns silently. Cass handed the notepad back and told her the truth she had been avoiding. You already know what you're going to do, she said softly. You're just waiting for someone to tell you it's okay. But before filing anything, Willa needed proof strong enough to silence the tiny voice inside her that still wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding. She drove back to her parents' house in Millbury, pretending everything was normal, smiling through dinner, accepting hugs, and sitting through another family weekend like the obedient daughter they expected her to be. Her mother made pot roast. Her father watched football from his recliner. The entire house felt painfully ordinary, which somehow made the betrayal even worse. Saturday morning, after her parents left for their weekly grocery trip, Willa walked into the garage and opened the metal filing cabinet beside her father's workbench. She found the documents almost immediately. The bottom drawer held years of legal paperwork, stacked neatly in folders: LLC registration forms, loan applications, tax documents, utility records, and copies of filings bearing her full name and social security number. Then she saw the forged signature, Willa R. Nash, written in handwriting she instantly recognized as her mother's. Diane curled her W a certain way, a tiny detail Willa had seen on birthday cards and school permission slips her entire life. The notary stamp hit even harder. Linda Pruitt, notary, public state of Ohio. Her Aunt Linda, her mother's closest friend, the woman who brought potato salad to every family barbecue and kissed Willa's forehead every Christmas. Another person had known another adult, had watched a 14-year-old girl's identity being stolen, and signed the papers anyway. Then Willa noticed the filing date, September 18th, her 14th birthday, while she blew out candles on a cheap grocery store cake, wishing for a new laptop. Her mother had been filing fraudulent business documents using her daughter's stolen identity. Standing in the garage, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and old wood, Willa finally understood that none of this had been desperation or panic. It had been a deliberate decision repeated over and over for nearly a decade. She photographed every page carefully, front and back, then returned the folders exactly where she found them before joining her parents for dinner like nothing had happened. Throughout the weekend, she quietly noticed all the things the stolen money had purchased: a brand new patio furniture set, upgraded kitchen appliances, expensive clothes with tags still attached in her mother's closet, and a fully financed lifestyle built on debt that belonged to her daughter. What hurt most was realizing her parents had been financially stable again for nearly 2 years. Her father had steady work. Her mother still had her job. They could have started paying the debt down or contacted creditors or admitted the truth. Instead, they bought fire pit tables and stand mixers, while the interest under Willa's name kept growing every single day. By the time she drove back to Columbus on Sunday night, something inside her had hardened permanently. Monday morning, before her first meeting at work, she called attorney Rebecca Holt and told her she was ready to file everything. The process took hours. Willa completed the FTC identity theft affidavit listing every fraudulent account, every fake signature, every forged tax filing, and for the first time in her life, she officially typed her parents' names into legal documents as suspects in a federal crime. Diane L. Nash, Carl R. Nash. She filed police reports with both the Columbus Police Department and the Millbury Police Department, attaching photographs of the LLC paperwork and evidence connecting the debts directly to her parents' address and bank accounts. Then she spent her lunch break disputing 23 separate fraudulent accounts with Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. Each form forced her to repeat the same painful truth again and again. Yes, the suspects were her parents. Yes, the fraud began when she was a minor. Yes, the debts were unauthorized by the time she submitted the final dispute. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely type. She went into the office break room and cried for exactly 4 minutes, not because she regretted it, but because she knew there was no one doing it now. The moment she hit submit, the family she grew up with effectively ended 2 weeks later. While sitting at her desk at work, Willa received a phone call from Special Agent Miriam Torres of the FBI Cleveland Field Office. Hearing the words FBI made her entire body go cold. Rebecca Holt had warned her the case could escalate into federal territory because of the fraudulent tax returns, wire fraud, and misuse of Social Security records. But Willa never expected federal investigators to contact her so quickly when she drove to Cleveland for the interview. Agent Torres walked her through every piece of evidence with calm precision. Then Torres revealed information Willa had not yet discovered herself. The fraudulent LLC had been connected to a registered post office box in Millbury, and IRS refund checks tied to the fake tax filings. More than $14,000 total had been mailed there over several years before being deposited into a checking account owned directly by Diane Nash at First National Bank. That detail changed everything. This was no longer just a case of desperate parents borrowing their daughter's credit to survive hard times. It was organized financial fraud involving forged government records, stolen tax refunds, and years of calculated deception. Sitting across from the federal agent beneath harsh fluorescent lights, Willa realized her parents had not accidentally crossed legal lines in moments of panic. They had built an entire hidden financial system using their daughter's identity and convinced themselves it was justified because they called it family. Willa Nash drove back from the FBI field office in Cleveland with both hands locked around the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached. The interview with Special Agent Miriam Torres had lasted nearly 4 hours, yet somehow the longest part came afterward, sitting alone in the parking lot staring at a blank concrete wall while her entire understanding of her family collapsed into something colder and uglier than betrayal. Until that moment, a small part of her still clung to the idea that her parents were desperate people who had crossed legal lines out of fear and survival. But Agent Torres had shown her bank records, IRS filings, refund deposits, and transaction histories that painted a different picture entirely. This was not panic. It was a system. Her parents had spent nearly a decade building a financial life on top of their daughter's stolen identity, and every piece of evidence proved they knew exactly what they were doing. IRS refund checks worth more than $14,000 had been mailed to a post office box connected to Nash Event Rentals LLC and deposited directly into an account owned by Diane Nash at First National Bank. The government believed Willa owned a profitable business and had overpaid taxes for years. Meanwhile, the real Willa had been shelving books at her college library job for barely more than minimum wage, eating instant noodles to stretch grocery money, and working 3 jobs just to survive school somewhere near Medina on the long drive back south. Willa finally forced herself to say the words out loud for the first time. My parents are criminals. Hearing it spoken aloud felt surreal, like dialogue from a courtroom drama instead of her real life. Yet the facts refused to soften themselves into anything gentler. Her parents had forged documents, filed fraudulent tax returns, stolen government refunds, open loans using a minor's social security number, and used her identity to finance cars, furniture, groceries, vacations, and years of comfortable living. The realization hollowed her out in a way anger never could. Criminals were supposed to be strangers. Criminals were not supposed to be the people who packed your school lunches or told you they loved you before bedtime. Over the next several months, the federal investigation expanded rapidly, and the emotional fallout spread through Willa's extended family like poison when FBI agents showed up at 1847 Birchwood Lane in June and informed Diane and Carl Nash they were subjects of an active federal investigation. Willa's phone exploded within hours. Her mother called, first furious and panicked, no longer pretending to cry. The FBI, Willa? You brought the FBI into this? She demanded, as if federal investigators had appeared because Willa was cruel instead of because Diane had committed years of fraud. Willa tried explaining that the IRS had escalated the case after discovering fraudulent tax returns, but her mother refused to hear it. In Diane's mind, accountability itself was betrayal. You gave them my name, she hissed bitterly. Willa answered quietly, you gave them my name first when I was 14. The silence that followed felt heavier than screaming. Then came the insults: ungrateful, selfish, disloyal. Her father sent a single text message that somehow hurt even more because of its simplicity. You destroyed this family. Todd's message arrived an hour later. You're dead to me. One by one, relatives joined in. Aunt Linda, the same woman who had notarized forged documents while Willa sat in math class at 14 years old, left a voicemail saying Diane had been under a lot of pressure. Uncle Ray insisted. Blood doesn't do this to blood, cousins whispered. Neighbors talked, church friends chose sides. Willa eventually stopped trying to explain because nobody wanted the truth. They wanted the easier story, the daughter who turned against her own parents. So she changed her phone number and cut herself off completely. For the first time in her life, nobody from her family could reach her. The silence that followed was devastating. It was also the first time she had felt safe in years. As the investigation continued, Agent Torres began methodically dismantling the financial structure Diane Nash had hidden behind the phrase family shares everything. Subpoenaed bank records from Nash Event Rentals LLC revealed years of deposits tied to party rentals, equipment leases, and event bookings across Ohio, but the withdrawals exposed the real purpose of the business. Mortgage payments for the family home were paid directly from the LLC account, car insurance for the Chevy Tahoe, grocery bills, restaurant charges, clothing boutiques in Toledo, vacation rentals in Myrtle Beach. There was virtually no separation between business expenses and personal spending. Diane had essentially transformed a fraudulently created company into her private checking account while using her daughter's identity as a shield. Then Agent Torres uncovered something even more serious: 3 separate cash withdrawals made within days of each other in amounts just under federal reporting limits. Willa immediately recognized the pattern because of her statistics background. Diane had intentionally split large cash withdrawals into smaller amounts to avoid triggering mandatory banking reports, a federal crime known as structuring every layer. Investigators uncovered exposed another offense beneath it: identity theft, tax fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, financial structuring conspiracy. The deeper Torres dug, the more obvious it became that this was never temporary survival. It was a long-running operation built on calculated deception. Then came the notary documents. Torres asked Willa directly whether she had physically been present when the LLC papers were notarized by Linda Pruitt. Willa immediately said Nash had been in school taking a math exam that afternoon. To verify it, she contacted Millbury High School and requested attendance records from 9th grade. The records still existed. September 18th, present all 7 periods. 5th period math exam score 92. Willa stared at that number for a long time after receiving the records while she sat in algebra class earning a 92 on a math test. Her mother's best friend had been notarizing forged documents that would eventually bury her under $340,000 in debt. That realization broke something fundamental inside her. Linda Pruitt was not some distant criminal associate. She was Aunt Linda, the woman who hugged her at graduations, brought potato salad to family barbecues, and called her sweetie every Christmas. Yet she had knowingly signed papers that helped destroy Willa's future. Every comforting memory now carried a second meaning. Underneath it, every smile felt contaminated by what those adults knew and chose to ignore. Life settled into a strange gray routine while the federal case slowly advanced. Willa continued working her analyst job in Columbus during the day, pretending normality still existed, while spending nights answering emails from Rebecca Holt and Agent Torres on Cass Donnelly's apartment floor. Cass became the closest thing Willa had to family. Now they spent Thanksgiving eating Thai takeout and watching documentaries because neither of them had the emotional energy for holiday traditions anymore. At Christmas, Cass' parents invited Willa to dinner in Akron. When Cass' mother hugged her at the front door and softly said, "We're glad you're here," Willa nearly broke apart right there in the entryway because kindness had started feeling unfamiliar. Then came her 24th birthday. Cass bought a grocery store cake with pink frosting exactly like the one Willa's mother used to buy every year. The sight of it made her chest tighten instantly. She could barely look at the candles without thinking about her 14th birthday. The day she blew out candles while her mother forged her identity. Across town, Willa found herself obsessing over a question she could never answer. Did her mother hesitate? Did Diane pause before typing her daughter's social security number into those forms? Did she look at the birthday cake sitting in the kitchen and feel even 1 second of guilt before deciding her daughter's future was worth sacrificing? Willa believed the hesitation probably existed. Maybe Diane paused for one heartbeat. Maybe her hand hovered above the keyboard. Then she typed the numbers anyway. By January, nearly 11 months after discovering the fraud, Agent Torres finally called with the update. Willa had been both expecting and dreading. The United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Ohio was preparing formal criminal charges. Willa stood frozen in the hallway at work while Torres calmly listed the counts under Consideration identity theft of a minor tax fraud mail fraud tied to IRS refund checks wire fraud connected to electronic transactions structuring financial withdrawals to evade federal reporting laws and conspiracy charges. Diane Nash faced the majority of the counts because investigators believed she orchestrated most of the operation, while Carl Nash faced conspiracy-related charges for knowingly participating and benefiting from the scheme. Willa leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe as Torres explained possible prison sentences attached to each offense: 20 years here, 5 years there, 7 years. For identity theft, the numbers blurred together until they no longer sounded real. These were not strangers being discussed anymore. These were the people who taught her how to ride a bike, who sat in folding chairs at her school concerts, who packed birthday candles into grocery store cakes every September. Yet beneath all those memories sat another undeniable truth: they had stolen nearly a decade of her life without remorse, and would have continued if she had never checked her credit report. Standing alone in the office hallway with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, Willa realized something painful but necessary. Reporting her parents had not destroyed her family. The fraud had destroyed it years earlier. She was simply the first person willing to say it out loud. Willa Nash listened in silence as Special Agent Miriam Torres calmly explained the full scope of the federal charges being prepared against her family. The list sounded unreal when spoken aloud, less like the story of ordinary people from a quiet Ohio town and more like the outline of a white-collar crime documentary. Diane Nash faced 11 federal counts, including identity theft of a minor, aggravated identity theft, multiple counts of tax fraud, mail fraud connected to stolen IRS refund checks, wire fraud tied to electronic transactions, and structuring financial withdrawals to evade federal reporting laws. Carl Nash faced conspiracy charges for knowingly participating in the scheme and benefiting from years of fraudulent income. Todd, her older brother, the same brother who once drove her to middle school when their mother worked late shifts and who taught her how to throw a baseball in the backyard, was now facing accessory and conspiracy charges because investigators believed he knowingly accepted tuition money generated through the fraudulent business tied to Willa's stolen identity. Even Linda Pruitt, Aunt Linda, the family friend who brought potato salad to every barbecue and hugged Willa at graduation ceremonies, had been charged for false notarization and aiding identity theft after investigators proved she knowingly notarized forged documents while Willa was physically sitting in school taking a 9th grade math exam. 22 total federal counts across 4 people Willa had shared holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners, and family photographs with. For most of her life, she stood in the hallway outside her office, gripping her phone so tightly her hand cramped while Torres read through the charges one by one. 20 years possible for some counts, 5 years for others, prison time that stretched so far into the future it barely felt measurable anymore. Willa finally asked the question that had haunted her for months. In cases like this, she said quietly, when it's family, do the parents ever actually understand what they did? Agent Torres paused for several seconds before answering with the kind of exhausted honesty that only comes from years of investigating human behavior. In my experience, she said, no, most of them believe they're the victim. The answer hit harder than any legal document ever had because it explained everything. Diane Nash truly believed she had sacrificed for her family. In her own mind, she was not a criminal mother who stole her daughter's future. She was a woman who did whatever was necessary to survive hard times. The fact that her daughter's life had been crushed in the process was to her collateral damage, not betrayal. A few weeks later, in February, a handwritten letter arrived at Cass Donnelly's apartment with no return address. The moment Willa saw the curled shape of the W on the envelope, she recognized her mother's handwriting instantly, the same handwriting that appeared on forged LLC documents filed under her name when she was 14 years old. Willa opened the letter slowly at the kitchen table while Cass pretended not to watch from across the room. The letter was not angry, that almost made it worse. Diane admitted she panicked after Carl lost his job years earlier. She described overdue mortgage notices, electricity shutoff warnings, braces Todd needed, and the terror of feeling like the family was collapsing around her. She insisted the fraud was supposed to be temporary. She promised she had intended to pay back every dollar before Willa ever needed credit herself, but every Time Diane, try to stop another emergency, appeared the furnace, failed the car broke down, tuition bills arrived, debts piled higher, and eventually the fraud grew too large to undo without exposing everything. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she wrote him, asking you to understand that I was drowning. Willa read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it in the same drawer that held her credit reports and FBI documents. She believed her mother had felt desperate. She believed there were nights Diane stood in the kitchen at 1847 Birchwood Lane, terrified about losing the house and ashamed she could not provide for her family. But Willa also understood something her mother never seemed willing to admit. Desperation does not erase choice. When people are drowning, they grab onto whatever keeps them afloat. Diane Nash grabbed onto her 14-year-old daughter's identity and held herself above water while pushing her child underneath. That was not survival anymore. That was a decision. Repeated over and over for nearly a decade, every fraudulent signature, every fake tax filing, every IRS refund deposit required another conscious choice. And somewhere during those years, the emergency had ended. The family stabilized financially. Carl found steady work again. The mortgage became manageable. The lights stayed on, yet they never stopped using Willa's name, because by then the fraud was no longer just survival, it was convenience. In March, nearly 13 months after discovering the original debt, Agent Torres called again with the update Willa had been dreading since the investigation began. The federal grand jury had officially approved indictments. Arrest warrants were being issued the following Tuesday morning, just 1 week before Thanksgiving. Willa sat frozen at her desk while Torres calmly outlined what would happen next. Federal agents would arrest Diane and Carl Nash at their home in Millbury. Linda Pruitt would be arrested separately at her residence. Todd had been informed through his attorney that he could voluntarily surrender or risk public arrest later. When the call ended, Willa stared blankly at her actuarial reports for nearly an hour, unable to focus on the numbers in front of her. The previous Thanksgiving she had spent on Cass' couch eating takeout and trying not to think about her family. This Thanksgiving her mother would likely be sitting inside federal custody awaiting arraignment. The weight of that reality settled over her like concrete. She barely slept during the days leading up to the arrests. Every night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling of the apartment while Cass quietly gave her space, understanding there were no comforting words left anymore. Willa kept replaying alternate versions of her life in her head. The version where she stayed silent, accepted responsibility for the debt, spent decades paying off accounts she never opened, and apologized to landlords and banks for a financial history that was never hers. That version of the story stretched endlessly forward into exhaustion and shame. The only reason this version existed at all was because she finally refused to carry the consequences alone. Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m., her phone rang before sunrise. It was Todd. His voice sounded hollow and mechanical, like someone reading from a script they no longer understood. He told her he had surrendered himself at the FBI field office in Cleveland shortly before agents arrived at their parents' house to execute the warrants. Diane and Carl were arrested at 7:15 in the morning while still wearing pajamas. According to Todd, the first thing their mother said after agents identified themselves was, "My daughter is doing this because she's angry at me." Willa sat silently on the edge of Cass' couch, listening to him describe the scene. While dawn slowly brightened the apartment windows, Todd kept insisting the family had only done what was necessary to survive, that Willa was sending her own parents to prison over money. But something inside her had finally hardened enough to answer. "Clearly, they stole my identity," she repeated. "They filed fake tax returns. They forged my signature. They used my social security number for years." Todd argued that she didn't even need credit when the fraud began, because she was only a teenager. That sentence snapped something loose inside her. "I was 14, Todd," she said quietly. "I was on the math team. I kept cash and envelopes under my mattress. I was a child." Silence filled the line after that. Then she reminded him of something he never wanted to face. His college tuition had been funded by a business built entirely on her stolen identity, while he enjoyed dorm rooms, meal plans, and paid tuition bills at Bowling Green State University. She was sleeping on an air mattress beside Cass' bookshelf, with collection agencies calling her before breakfast every morning. "You knew," she told him, "and you still took it." Todd never answered directly. A few seconds later, he hung up. Later that afternoon, attorney Rebecca Holt called with updates from the initial court proceedings. Diane Nash's defense team had already begun constructing the narrative they planned to present: a desperate mother making impossible decisions. During financial collapse, in early statements to investigators, Diane repeatedly claimed she never thought of the fraud as stealing because family shares everything, but federal prosecutors pushed back aggressively in court filings. One line from the Assistant United States Attorney stayed with Willa long afterward. The defendant's 14-year-old daughter did not consent to sharing her identity, credit history, or future financial stability. Reading that sentence felt strangely emotional because it was the first time an authority figure had described what happened to her with absolute clarity. For months, family members had framed the situation as betrayal, disloyalty, revenge, or ingratitude, but the prosecutors stripped away all the emotional manipulation and reduced the case to its simplest truth: a child could not legally or morally consent to becoming the financial foundation of her parents' survival. Sitting alone in Cass' apartment that night with legal documents spread around her once again, Willa realized something important. The case had never really been about money. The $341,000 mattered. Of course, the destroyed credit mattered. The years of fraud mattered. But underneath all of it was a much deeper wound: the realization that the people who were supposed to protect her had looked at their frightened 14-year-old daughter and decided her future was an acceptable thing to sacrifice. This was never really about anger for Willa Nash. It was not about revenge either, no matter how many relatives whispered that word behind her back after the arrest. Revenge would have been loud and reckless and emotional. What Willa did was quiet, methodical, documented. She did what data analysts do when the numbers stop making sense. She followed the pattern to its source and refused to look away. Once she found it, long after the sentencing hearings ended and the federal prison transfers were complete, the story kept unfolding through the smaller consequences that never appear in court records. Carl Nash tried to distance himself immediately, telling investigators he had simply signed whatever Diane placed in front of him. Diane insisted she had carried the entire family for decades and deserved understanding instead of punishment. Linda Pruitt cooperated with prosecutors as soon as the pressure mounted, admitting Diane told her the 14-year-old girl whose signature she notarized already knew about it. Everyone passed responsibility downward like a hot object. Nobody wanted to hold Carl blamed Diane. Linda blamed trust. Todd blamed survival. Diane blamed desperation. And somehow through all of it, they still circled back to blaming Willa for refusing to quietly absorb the damage. The cruelest part is realizing how close the fraud came to lasting forever. If that property manager in Columbus had used different wording on the phone, if he had simply said denied instead of your credit report is informative, Willa might never have pulled her records at all. She might have spent years believing she was mysteriously failing at adulthood, never understanding why landlords rejected her applications or why banks refused her credit cards. One careful word from a stranger changed the direction of her entire life. Informative, a single ordinary word that cracked open 9 years of buried fraud. The federal plea agreements arrived months later after prosecutors weighed every charge and every possible sentence. Diane Nash pleaded guilty to identity theft of a minor and multiple counts of tax fraud in exchange for prosecutors dropping several additional charges that could have extended her sentence much further. She received 30 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, and full restitution responsibility for the entire $341,227 attached to Willa's name. Carl pleaded guilty to conspiracy and filing false documents, receiving 18 months in federal custody along with supervised release and shared financial restitution. Todd avoided prison, but received probation, community service, and a separate restitution order equal to the exact amount of tuition money tied to the fraudulent business revenue that funded his education. Linda Pruitt lost her notary license permanently and accepted probation after admitting she falsely notarized legal documents involving a minor who had never been present. Willa did not attend any sentencing hearing. Attorney Rebecca Holt offered to sit beside her in court. Agent Torres told her she had every right to be there. Willa declined both offers. She did not need to watch her mother cry in front of a judge. She did not need to hear legal arguments about hardship or survival or family loyalty. She had already said everything necessary through evidence, affidavits, credit reports, and signatures on federal paperwork. The number that once destroyed her life, $341227, now appeared on federal restitution orders. Instead, the debt finally belonged to the people who created it. 3 weeks after sentencing, another letter arrived from Diane, this time mailed from a federal correctional institution in West Virginia. Willa recognized the curled shape of her mother's Handwriting before she even opened the envelope, the letter carried the same emotional pattern as every conversation they had shared since the fraud was exposed. Diane accused Willa of destroying the family. She wrote about prison cells' damaged reputations, Todd struggling to find employment because of his criminal record, and Linda losing both her business and marriage. She insisted they could have worked it out privately if only Willa had come to them first instead of involving law enforcement. According to Diane, she and Carl would have found second jobs, made payment plans, and repaired the damage eventually. Not once in the entire letter did she apologize directly for stealing her daughter's identity. Not once did she acknowledge that a 14-year-old child had no ability to consent to becoming the financial foundation of her parents' survival strategy. Diane still framed herself as the injured party even while writing from a prison cell created entirely by her own choices. Willa read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it into the same drawer as the original 47-page credit report and Diane's earlier letter full of excuses. 3 documents sat together in that drawer like evidence from 3 stages of the same pattern: denial, justification, and blame. Some people never change, even after federal convictions. Diane Nash stole her daughter's future, got caught, went to prison, and still managed to believe she was the true victim in the story. The family fractured exactly the way damaged families usually do, not all at once, but slowly along fault lines that had existed for years beneath polite holiday conversations and casseroles at Thanksgiving dinners. Uncle Ray stopped speaking to Willa completely and told relatives she was cold-hearted. Aunt Margaret mailed sympathy cards reminding her that she is still your mother, as though biology erased fraud. Other relatives chose silence because silence felt safer than taking sides, but there were cracks in the family narrative too. Cousin Sarah called late one evening in a nervous voice and admitted she had checked her own credit report after hearing rumors about the investigation. She discovered unfamiliar accounts opened when she was 19 years old. That revelation made Willa physically sick because it confirmed what Agent Torres suspected all along. Diane's fraud had spread beyond one child. Willa immediately referred Sarah to attorney Holt. The pattern was repeating itself in another branch of the family tree. Yet among all the disappointment and betrayal, one conversation stayed with Willa longer than the rest. Carl's elderly mother, Louise, called from her assisted living facility outside Toledo and spoke with simple honesty. She admitted she did not understand all the legal or financial details, but she understood enough to know her son and daughter-in-law had done something wrong. Most importantly, she told Willa she was sorry she had to carry that burden alone. It was not a dramatic apology. It did not erase anything, but it was the closest thing to accountability anyone in the family ever offered her. Willa visited her grandmother the following weekend, and they drank instant coffee together without discussing courtrooms or prison sentences or fraud. The silence between them felt gentler than any explanation. 14 months after Willa first discovered the debt, the credit bureaus finally completed the fraud investigations. One by one, the accounts disappeared. The 6 fraudulent credit cards vanished from her reports. The Chevy Tahoe loan vanished. The utility accounts collection, civil judgments, and business credit lines vanished. Her monstrous 47-page credit file collapsed into 3 clean pages containing only real information connected to her actual life. Her credit score slowly climbed upward as if recovering from a long illness. 387, then 412, then 508, then 614, then finally 691. Not perfect, but finally hers. 6 months after the sentencing hearings, Willa applied once again for an apartment through the same property management company that rejected her years earlier. Same neighborhood on the east side of Columbus, same narrow kitchen, same second floor layout with afternoon sunlight through the windows. This time the property manager called back within 48 hours and approved her application immediately. When he handed her the keys, Willa stood there staring at 2 tiny brass pieces of metal resting in her palm. 1 key for the deadbolt, 1 key for the mailbox. Ordinary objects that suddenly felt enormous because both belonged entirely to her. The lease carried her legal name signed in her own handwriting for the first time without fraud or manipulation attached to it. She unlocked the apartment door and stepped into empty white rooms with no furniture except an air mattress she would move in later. The Silence inside the apartment felt unfamiliar at first. No collection calls, no accusations, no threats disguised as family loyalty, just quiet. She sat cross-legged on the floor holding the keys while afternoon light stretched across the kitchen tiles, and realized something profound. Peace sometimes arrives looking incredibly small. Sometimes it arrives as two brass keys and an empty room where nobody can steal your future anymore. When people told Willa she should forgive her parents for her own sake, she stopped arguing with them. Most people hear stories like hers and immediately search for reconciliation because they are uncomfortable with the possibility that some betrayals permanently reshape relationships, but forgiveness was never the point. Willa did not spend 14 months fighting federal investigations because she wanted revenge. She did it because survival built on silence is not peace at all, it is captivity. For years her parents taught her that family shares everything, but what they really meant was that Willa was expected to quietly absorb whatever damage protected everyone else. The moment she refused, the entire structure collapsed. Looking back, she understood something now that 14-year-old Willa could never have understood while blowing out candles on a grocery store birthday cake and wishing for a laptop with a cracked screen beside her. Love without boundaries becomes permission. Loyalty without accountability becomes exploitation. And sometimes the bravest thing a daughter can do is finally say no to the people who taught her she was never allowed to. This was never just a story about debt. It was not really about credit scores or LLC filings or federal charges, even though those things changed the course of Willa Nash's life forever. At its core, this was the story of a girl whose identity was stolen before she was old enough to understand what identity even meant. A girl who spent her teenage years saving cash in white envelopes under her mattress while her parents quietly used her social security number to build a second life behind her back. A girl who believed her family was simply struggling financially, never realizing that the reason her brother got braces, a car, and fully paid college tuition while she worked 3 part-time jobs and survived on scholarships was because her future had already been mortgaged without her knowledge while she studied statistics at college libraries. Late into the night, her name was attached to business accounts, tax returns, loans, and debt collections. She had never seen her mother bought groceries, patio furniture, appliances, and birthday cakes using credit lines tied to a 14-year-old child who still needed permission slips for school field trips. And perhaps the hardest part for Willa to accept was not even the fraud itself, but the realization that nobody in her family, not her father, not her brother, not her mother's closest friend ever stopped long enough to ask whether she deserved a choice in any of it. They all convinced themselves that survival justified permission, that desperation erased consent, that family shares everything meant a child's future was available for use if times became difficult enough. For years, the theft remained invisible because identity theft inside families rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There are no ski masks, no smashed windows, no strangers lurking in parking lots. Sometimes it looks like birthday dinners and Christmas mornings and a mother braiding her daughters' hair before school. Sometimes it sounds like a father saying grace at the dinner table while fraudulent tax returns sit filed under his child's name. Willa's parents still hugged her, still drove her to college orientation, still told her they loved her at the end of phone calls while collection notices and business debt quietly accumulated beneath her identity, like rot hidden behind a painted wall. That was what made the betrayal so disorienting. The same people who taught her how to ride a bike and helped her decorate science fair posters also built a financial empire on top of her stolen name. They compartmentalized the damage so completely that by the time Willa uncovered the truth, they genuinely seemed shocked. She viewed it as a crime. Diane Nash saw herself as a mother who sacrificed everything for her family, not as someone who committed federal fraud against her own daughter. Carl Nash convinced himself he was merely signing papers. His wife handled Todd benefited from tuition money tied to the fraudulent business, while telling himself it was simply how families survive hard times. Nobody wanted to see themselves as thieves because the victim was someone they loved, but love does not erase harm, and intention does not erase consequences. A child can still drown even if the person holding her underwater insists they were only trying to stay afloat. By the end of it all, after the FBI interviews and federal indictments and courtroom negotiations, after prison sentences and restitution, Orders and months of relatives calling her selfish or cruel, Willa finally understood something that changed the way she viewed family forever. Boundaries are not betrayal. Accountability is not revenge. Reporting a crime does not become immoral simply because the criminal shares your last name. For most of her life, Willa had been trained to confuse obedience with love. Good daughters stayed quiet. Good daughters sacrificed. Good daughters absorbed pain so the family system could continue functioning. Without disruption the moment she stopped doing that, everyone around her called her destructive, but the truth was far simpler and far more uncomfortable. The family was already broken long before she filed the reports. The fraud itself was the fracture. Willa merely stopped pretending it wasn't there. She often thought about the alternate version of her future, where she never checked her credit report, the version where she kept getting denied apartments and loans for reasons she could never explain. The version where she spent decades paying off debts attached to her name because confronting the truth felt too painful. That version of her life would have looked quieter from the outside, but it would have required sacrificing herself indefinitely to protect the people who harmed her. Instead, she chose something else. She chose documentation over denial, truth over comfort, evidence over loyalty. And although that decision cost her most of her family, it gave her something they had already taken once before: the right to own her own future. Now, every month Willa logs into her credit accounts and checks every line carefully. She reviews balances, verifies addresses, confirms inquiries, and watches her financial history with the kind of vigilance that only comes from having it stolen once before. She does not do it because she lives in fear anymore. She does it because those numbers finally belong to her. Her credit report no longer contains fraudulent businesses or forged signatures or debt from lives she never lived. It contains only truth: a modest apartment in Columbus, a legal signature written in her own hand, a mailbox key attached to a lease. She chose herself. Small things maybe, but sacred. After years of violations, sometimes she still remembers sitting on the floor of Cass Donnelly's apartment surrounded by 47 pages of debt, feeling as though her entire identity had dissolved beneath her feet. And then she thinks about the quiet apartment she eventually unlocked with 2 brass keys and realizes recovery is not always dramatic. Sometimes healing looks like ordinary ownership: a clean credit report, a safe mailbox, a locked front door nobody else can legally open. People still tell her she should forgive her parents because family is family, but Willa no longer argues with them. They are speaking from lives where trust was never weaponized against them. What she knows now is this family does not get unlimited access to you simply because you share blood. Love without consent becomes control. Sacrifice demanded without permission becomes exploitation. And a child's future is not an emergency fund waiting to be used when life gets hard. So this is the part of the story Willa hopes people actually remember, not the prison sentences or the FBI investigation or even the $341,227 in fraudulent debt. She hopes they remember the 14-year-old girl sitting at a birthday table making wishes over pink frosting candles while somewhere across town adults were forging her signature onto legal documents she could not even legally understand. She hopes parents hear this story and check their children's credit reports before damage has years to grow unnoticed. She hopes young adults understand that confusion around money is sometimes a warning sign, not personal failure. And most of all, she hopes anyone trapped inside toxic loyalty understands that boundaries are not cruelty. Saying no to exploitation does not make you selfish. Protecting yourself does not make you heartless. Willa Nash spent 9 years carrying debt that never belonged to her, 14 months fighting to reclaim her name, and one quiet afternoon sitting on the floor of an empty apartment holding 2 brass keys that finally did in the end. Those keys mattered more than the money ever did because they represented something nobody in her family had ever truly given her before: ownership over her own life.